Okay, so now we're going to talk about control strategies. How do we control our subordinates? There's really two sort of approaches. One is the traditional strategies, which we're going to get to in a moment. But before we get into some of those traditional strategies, like for example, frustrating people and clouding information and not being clear with our objectives, that would be more traditional tactics. I want to talk about energy levels, which are very, very effective at controlling people. It's very hard to control outcomes, but it's very much easier to control energy. Is somebody driven by fear, shame, and guilt are very, very contagious and generally don't change. So we can drive people down to a lower energy level. For example, on the chart, the lowest energy levels are shame and guilt. And you can see in the histogram that most people live in that area. And so we're not creating shame and guilt, we're just taking advantage of that which already exists. And so it's very easy to control people in that situation because they don't have the strength to see at the level of the what, the why and the who. What's happening? What's really going on? What are these traditional tactics? So they tend to be very, very susceptible to traditional control tactics, which we're going to get to in a second. And so, for example, higher energy levels are energies like love and joy, and people who live in that environment are very, very powerful, and we don't necessarily want them as managers in our pyramid. We really want more of that dog and sheep mentality. An important point on this chart is enlightenment. What does it mean to be enlightened? We all seek enlightenment. And really what it means is that your ability to traverse all of those energy levels without getting confused. So if you live in joy and love, areas we like to live in, that your ability to understand people, this is where the psychotic element comes in, the ability to understand, really connect with people who are living at a much, much lower energy level is really important to understand how to communicate with them and how to control them. And that's critical to managing the personnel in the organizations. So we just reviewed energy levels, and now I want to talk about how do we apply these energy levels. And we apply them differently at different levels of the pyramid. For example, at the lowest level, at the doer level, we generally want shame and guilt to rule. We want people to do what they're told, essentially. At the salesperson level, we want pride and fear to drive people. More of a dog pack mentality. And generally, middle management, various combinations of shame and guilt. Senior management, acceptance. They're kind of aware of the pyramid, but they have to accept that there isn't anything they can do about it. And then we as orchestrators in a whole different world, more joy, peace, and enlightenment. So what are some of the tactics that we can use to generate this kind of behavior? So for example, shame and guilt is very effective at creating sheep. The school system really generates a lot of shame and guilt naturally, so we can leverage that which we have. Also, shame is very, very infectious. So if you feel a lot of shame and guilt in your life and it's unresolved, you're going to tend to pass it on to your children. So a lot of these behaviors are very self-sustaining. So there's plenty of supply for people who exhibit that kind of behavior. And see, the idea is they tend to self-select. If you're in an environment where we want that kind of behavior, people who won't accept it are just going to leave. So eventually you're going to end up with people who accept that kind of behavior. And so some examples, if you don't have enough supply of shame and guilt, you can actually create more shame and guilt very effectively. One tactic that we use is inconsistency. And let me give you a very simple example. You say there's no stupid questions. So if somebody asks a question, you respond in a way that makes it sound like it's a stupid question. So you don't tell them it's a stupid question, but you shame them when you answer the question. You're essentially treating them like children. So treating people like children is a very, very effective way of driving them down to the energy where they stay in the place where they need to be, filling the sheep-like role that we need. And so what's really important to keep in mind is that you have to be it. An enlightened individual, we know that we're using these tactics for control purposes. So when we go down and we actually feel the shame when we talk to somebody, what kind of question is that? We have to really be it. But then when we're done, we bring ourselves back up to the level because we know it's just a tactic. It's very, very important. Another emotion is fear. Fear is very good at creating dogs, that pack mentality, that competitive pack mentality. And the thing to remember is that we are living in a very, very competitive environment. Our stockholders are demanding quarterly returns. So in order to compete, we must have that pack mentality. So joy tends to be very natural in people So the idea is we have to quickly change that joy to fear. Fear is what drives dogs. That's what we need to compete. And so fear, again, can be very natural from the school system, but if we don't have a supply of fear, we can very easily create it. One of the biggest fears we have is being judged unfairly. So the key is to continue that process of judging people unfairly to generate fear. So one way to do that is to generate and create unclear objectives. This way people are never sure what they're supposed to be doing. Then it's very easy to judge them. Also, misaligning power versus liability. So what that means is that somebody has the responsibility and the liability if something goes wrong, but they don't have the power to prevent it from happening. So that's very effective at creating fear. Doling out approval sparingly is another classic tactic. Also, the idea is you want to promote following instructions. So if people make one little mistake, they're always going to be in fear of making one little mistake. And the good thing is that this is all pretty consistent with the way the school system grades people. So this is very natural. People accept this because it's very natural. And we'll get more into that in detail tomorrow and the day after. So the personnel that we select is driven by the kind of emotions that we want. But there's a couple other issues I wanted to cover as well, real briefly, which is the level of intelligence. It's important to have smart people, but not too clever. So for example, there's different kinds of smart. There's knowledge. We want pretty high on the knowledge kind of smart. Intelligence smart, we want moderate. We don't want them too high because they're going to get an idea of how the pyramid works. We want wisdom, but limited to the field that they're in. And we want their emotion, this is very important, their emotional intelligence to be very, very low. Because people with a strong emotional intelligence have a very, very difficult to control. And intuitive is very, very useful to have, but we have to be very, very careful. Because intuition combined with high emotional intelligence can be very, very dangerous for our control tactics. And so the problem is sometimes we run across people who are very, very clever and very, very smart. And in other countries, typically the smartest people they kill. We don't do that in this country. We just humiliate smart people. And if we're lucky, we can drive them to substance abuse. And that's very, very effective at taking them out as a threat. And so really we want people who are confident, loyal, and smart, but naive. And another important factor is never, ever, ever, if you can avoid it, put an engineer in as a manager. Engineers are used to being accountable. They're used to having clear objectives and to managing tightly to those objectives. We do not want objectives to be clear so that we have the ability to control and to manipulate and maneuver as we need. A couple other additional tactics. One is use the victim mentality. In this country, we have a tremendous victim mentality. People get off on being a victim. And so you really want to take advantage of that. People love drama. They watch it on TV. They hear about it in songs. So it's very, very powerful. You really want to take advantage of that. Blame. The idea is to spread blame to people. Have them used to accepting blame so that they don't have the power to come in and start asking questions. Try to promote the idea that there's a single answer, that debate is not an issue, that there is a right answer to something. So you're really driving people towards that. And remember, we're trying to focus on return on investment. We're not here to create a pleasant working environment for all people. Some people we need to because we need them to be creative, but we really want to drive the competitiveness because that's what our competitors are doing. It's very important to understand that. So these are some tactics that we use to really set that energy level where it needs to be, low for most of the people, a little bit higher for the salespeople, a little bit higher for managers, and some people, the creative people, we want it to be at high energy levels. And then we can use our traditional tactics to then control them.